Imagine a warm summer evening in a small Michigan town where the air is thick with humidity and the only sounds are the cicadas and the distant whistle of a train. It is June 8, 1953. The sun has just begun to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields and farms of Beecher, a small unincorporated community in Genesee County just north of Flint. Families are finishing their suppers. Children are playing in yards, chasing fireflies, their laughter carrying on the heavy air. Men are coming in from the fields, tired from a long day of work. Women are washing dishes, listening to the radio, planning the next day's meals. It is an ordinary evening in an ordinary place, and no one knows that within the hour their world will be torn apart. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what Beecher was like in 1953. It was a farming community, a place where people knew their neighbors, where everyone went to the same church, where the biggest news of the year might be the high school basketball game or the county fair. It was a place of modest homes, many of them built by the families themselves, with vegetable gardens in the back and clotheslines in the side yards. It was a place where doors were left unlocked, where children walked to school, where the biggest worry a person had was whether the rain would come in time for the crops. It was a place that felt safe, the kind of safe that people today might call innocent. But the weather that day was anything but innocent. The morning had been hot and sticky, the kind of heat that presses down on you from the moment you step outside. By afternoon, the sky had taken on a strange yellowish tint, a color that old-timers sometimes called a buttermilk sky. Those who paid attention to such things knew that a buttermilk sky often meant trouble, but most people were too busy with their daily lives to notice. They went about their business, working, shopping, visiting, as the air grew heavier and the silence grew deeper. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, the first signs of a storm began to appear. A low rumble of thunder far off to the west. A freshening breeze that stirred the leaves and made the wind chimes dance. The radio carried a warning. A severe thunderstorm watch was in effect for much of southern Michigan. But thunderstorm watches were common in June and people paid them little mind. They had seen bad storms before. They had seen rain and hail and wind. They thought they knew what a storm could do. They did not know what a tornado could do. In 1953, tornadoes were not well understood by the general public. The word itself carried a kind of mythic weight, a sense of something terrible and almost unreal. There was no national weather radar network. There were no tornado warning systems as we know them today. A tornado watch or warning meant something different then, something vaguer and less urgent. The technology to detect these storms was still in its infancy, and the science of forecasting was still being learned. When the Weather Bureau issued a bulletin, it was often too general to be useful. People heard the words, but they did not always know what to do with them. In Beecher that evening, many people did not hear the bulletin at all. The radio was on in some homes, but it was tuned to music or to the news of the day. The news that day was full of other things. The Korean War was on everyone's mind. President Eisenhower was in the headlines. The Cold War was heating up. A tornado in Michigan seemed like a distant possibility, not an immediate threat. As the sun went down, the storm began to take shape. A line of thunderstorms developed over the western part of the state and began to move east. One of those storms grew particularly strong, a supercell thunderstorm with a deep rotating updraft. It passed over the city of Lansing around 6:30, bringing heavy rain and strong winds but no major damage. It continued east, gathering strength as it moved into Genesee County. By 7 o'clock, it was approaching Beecher. The people who were outside saw the sky turn an ugly greenish-black. They felt the wind shift and pick up, a hot wind that seemed to come from nowhere. They heard a sound like a freight train, a low and growing roar that was unlike any thunder they had ever heard. Some of them ran for their homes. Some of them called to their families to get into the basement or the root cellar. Some of them just stood and stared, frozen by a sight they could not understand. The tornado touched down at about 7:20 in the evening. It was a monster. The National Weather Service later estimated it as an F5, the highest rating on the Fujita scale, with winds over 260 miles per hour. It was a half-mile wide, a black wall of destruction that swept across the farmland and into the heart of Beecher. It did not skip or hop. It did not wobble. It came straight on without mercy, without pause, and it took everything in its path. In the first few seconds, the tornado tore through a row of farmhouses. It ripped roofs off, shattered windows, turned walls into flying splinters. It picked up cars and tossed them into fields. It uprooted ancient oak trees and threw them through the air like toothpicks. It killed a family of 5 in one house, a young couple in another, an elderly man and his wife in a third. The wind was so strong that it drove pieces of straw into the trunks of trees and embedded gravel into the walls of buildings. One survivor remembered seeing his neighbor's house simply disappear. He was looking out his window, and then the house was gone, not flattened, not damaged. Gone. All that was left was a bare concrete foundation. He did not understand what he was seeing. He thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. It was only when he heard the screaming that he realized what had happened. Another survivor remembered being in her kitchen when the roof lifted off. She said it was like the whole house took a deep breath and then there was nothing above her but the sky. She grabbed her baby and ran for the basement, but the stairs were already gone. She threw herself over the child and held on as the world came apart around her. When it was over, she was lying in an open field, still holding her baby, and there was no house anywhere. She was not sure how she got there. She was not sure where the basement had gone. She was not sure of anything except that she was alive, and that was a miracle. The tornado passed through Beecher in about 5 minutes. 5 minutes, that is all it took to change everything. In those 300 seconds, it destroyed more than 300 homes and damaged hundreds more. It killed 116 people in Genesee County alone, most of them in Beecher. It injured over 800 others. It caused millions of dollars in damage, but that number does not begin to capture the loss. You cannot measure a life in dollars. You cannot measure a community shattered in dollars. When the tornado passed, the survivors crawled out of the wreckage to a scene of unimaginable horror. The streets were gone, buried under piles of debris. The landmarks were gone. The trees were gone. The whole world looked different, strange, unrecognizable. People wandered through the ruins, calling for their families, digging through the rubble with their bare hands. They found bodies. They found survivors. They found things they could never unsee. A local doctor who had been at his house when the storm hit walked to the nearest standing building and turned it into a makeshift hospital. He treated the wounded for hours, using whatever supplies he could find. He set broken bones, sewed up cuts, did what he could for the dying. He worked by lantern light with no anesthesia, no proper tools, no help except for the neighbors who brought in the injured. He did not stop until the sun came up. The first rescuers arrived within an hour. They came from Flint, from Genesee County, from nearby towns and cities. They came with trucks and ambulances and bulldozers. They came with flashlights and shovels and first aid kits. They came because they heard the news on the radio and they knew they had to help. They did not know what they were walking into. They did not know the scale of the disaster. They found a wasteland. The Red Cross arrived the next morning. The National Guard was called in. The governor declared a state of emergency. President Eisenhower, who was in the middle of a cross-country trip, sent a message of sympathy and promised federal aid. The story made national headlines. People across the country read about Beecher and wept. But here is something you should know. In the midst of all that horror, there were stories of courage. There were stories of neighbors saving neighbors, of strangers carrying the injured to safety, of people who had lost everything using what little they had left to help someone else. There was a man who pulled 6 people from a collapsed house, working alone for over an hour while the walls threatened to collapse around him. There was a woman who took in 30 children whose parents could not be found. She fed them from her ruined kitchen, gave them clothes from her own closet, held them when they cried. She did not know if her own children were alive. She just kept going. There was a young couple who had been married for only a year. Their house was completely destroyed, all their belongings scattered across the fields, but they found each other in the rubble and that was enough. They held hands and walked through the debris looking for survivors. They did not stop to mourn what they had lost. They kept moving, kept searching, kept hoping, and there was a preacher who climbed onto the roof of what was left of his church and began to pray. He did not pray for answers. He did not pray for understanding. He just prayed for strength. He prayed that the people of Beecher would find the courage to rebuild. He prayed that they would not lose hope. His voice carried across the ruins and people stopped what they were doing to listen. They wept. They held each other. They kept working. The next morning, the sun rose over Beecher and the full scope of the disaster became clear. The town was gone. The fields were covered in debris. The air smelled of dust and gasoline and something else, something sweet and terrible that no one wanted to name. The survivors gathered in small groups staring at the horizon trying to understand what had happened. They had lost their homes. They had lost their neighbors. They had lost the world they knew, but they were still there. They were still alive, and in that there was something that looked like hope. The days that followed were a blur of rescue and recovery. Search parties combed the fields. Volunteers cleared the roads. The injured were taken to hospitals in Flint and Pontiac and even as far away as Detroit. The dead were taken to a makeshift morgue set up in a local school. Families waited for news, huddled in shelters, clinging to the hope that their loved ones might still be found alive. The Red Cross set up a relief center in a nearby church. They distributed food and water and clothing. They gave out blankets and medicine and money. They helped people fill out forms for disaster assistance. They listened to the stories, the same stories over and over, each one a little different but all of them full of loss. And through it all, the people of Beecher kept going. They dug through the rubble. They salvaged what they could. They buried their dead. They began to plan for a future that seemed impossible, a future without the homes and the schools and the churches that had been the fabric of their lives. The author of this podcast episode is trying to tell you a story. It is a story about a tornado, yes, but it is also a story about a community. It is a story about what happens when the worst thing you can imagine becomes real. It is a story about grief and survival and the slow, painful work of rebuilding. And it is a story about a town called Beecher, Michigan, a town that was destroyed on a summer evening in 1953, a town that found a way to rise again. But there is so much more to this story. There are the details of the rescue effort, the stories of individual families, the long road to recovery. There is the question of why the warning systems failed and what was learned from that failure. There is the legacy of the Beecher tornado, a disaster that changed the way America thinks about severe weather. All of that is coming. Right now, we are still in the opening moments. The tornado has passed. The survivors are emerging from the ruins. The sun is rising on a new day, a day that no one in Beecher ever expected to see. And the work is just beginning. The dead will be laid to rest. The injured will heal or they will not. The homes will be rebuilt or they will not. The town will go on, changed forever, carrying the memory of that night as a scar and a lesson and a testament to the strength of ordinary people. This is the story of the Beecher tornado, and it is only beginning. And so the story of Beecher entered its second chapter. The first chapter had been written in wind and darkness and terror. The second chapter would be written in dust and sweat and tears. It would be written by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, by mothers and fathers and children who refused to let their town die. In the days after the tornado, the survivors began to understand the true scale of what had happened. The initial count of the dead had been a rough estimate, a number pulled from the. As the search parties worked their way through the fields and the ruins, that number grew. It grew with every body pulled from the debris, with every missing person who did not come home, with every family that gathered at the morgue to identify a loved one. By the time the sun set on the second day, the death toll had climbed past 90. By the end of the week, it would reach 116. And that number, they would later learn, was almost certainly incomplete. Some victims were never found. Some were buried in unmarked graves, their names lost to the storm. The morgue was set up in the gymnasium of the local high school, one of the few buildings that had survived mostly intact. The dead were brought in on stretchers and tarps and in the backs of pickup trucks. They were laid out in rows on the basketball court, covered in sheets, waiting for someone to come and claim them. The volunteers who worked there were not trained for this. They were teachers and farmers and shopkeepers who had never seen death up close. They did their best. They washed the bodies. They tried to make them presentable. They wrote down descriptions and tried to match them to the frantic calls that came in from across the county. The families came in a steady stream. They walked through the gymnasium with their eyes fixed on the ground, afraid to look up, afraid of what they might see. When they found their loved one, there was no sound, or there was a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget. It was a sound that cut through the hum of the generators and the murmur of the volunteers and the distant rumble of the bulldozers clearing the streets. It was a sound that said everything and nothing. And when they did not find their loved one, they went back out into the ruins and kept searching. They searched until they could not search anymore. They searched until hope ran out. The youngest victim of the Beecher tornado was a baby, not yet a year old. The oldest was an elderly man who had lived in the same house for 50 years. In between were fathers and mothers and sons and daughters, entire families wiped out in an instant. There was a woman who had just celebrated her wedding anniversary the day before the storm. There was a boy who had been playing baseball with his friends when the sky turned green. He ran home but never made it. His glove was found a mile away, still clutched in his hand. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone. The dead were not statistics. They were neighbors and friends and coworkers. They were the people you saw at the grocery store, the people who sat next to you in church, the people who waved as you drove past their house. Their absence was a hole in the fabric of the community, a hole that would never be filled. But even as the grief settled over Beecher like a second storm, the work of recovery continued. The National Guard had arrived in force. They set up checkpoints, controlled access to the disaster zone, and helped with the search and rescue efforts. The Army brought in heavy equipment, bulldozers and cranes to clear the debris. The Red Cross established a relief center in a church that had lost its steeple but still had its walls. They distributed food and water and clothing and medicine. They set up cots for families who had nowhere to go. They listened to the stories, the same stories over and over, each one a little different but all of them full of loss. One of the first things the Red Cross did was set up a system to reunite families. The telephone lines were down, so they used the school buses as makeshift communication hubs. They sent runners on foot to carry messages from one shelter to another. They posted lists of the missing and the found on the walls of the relief center. Every time a new name was added to the found list, a small cheer went up from the crowd. Every time a name was added to the missing list, the silence was heavy. There was a woman named Martha who had been separated from her husband during the storm. She had been in the basement of their home when the tornado hit. When she came up, the house was gone and her husband was nowhere to be seen. She searched for hours, calling his name, digging through the rubble until her hands were bloody. She found him eventually, pinned under a fallen beam, barely alive. She pulled him out with the help of a neighbor. They carried him to the makeshift hospital where the doctor worked on him for 3 hours. He survived. Martha never let go of his hand the whole time. There was a family of 6 who had been at home when the tornado struck. The father had heard the warning on the radio and had herded everyone into the basement just in time. They huddled together as the house collapsed around them, the walls groaning and screaming, the roof tearing away. They thought they were going to die. But when the storm passed, they found themselves still alive, buried under a pile of debris but alive. They clawed their way out one by one, emerging into a world that looked like a battlefield. Their house was gone, their car was gone, the street was gone, but all 6 of them walked away. They stood in the middle of the ruins, holding each other, crying and laughing and shaking. They had lost everything, but they had not lost each other. The stories of survival were matched by stories of loss. There was a young man named David who had been at work when the tornado hit. He worked at a factory in Flint, miles away from Beecher. He had heard the news on the radio and had driven home as fast as he could, weaving through debris and down power lines on roads that were barely passable. When he got to his neighborhood, he could not find his house. He could not find his street. He walked through the ruins calling for his wife and his 2 children. He searched for hours. He found their bodies in a field not far from what used to be their front door. He sat down in the dirt next to them and he did not move for a long time. When the rescue workers found him, he was still sitting there holding his daughter's hand. The town buried its dead in a mass grave at a local cemetery. It was not what anyone wanted, but there was no time for individual funerals and no money for individual plots. The county arranged for a mass funeral service, attended by hundreds of people, many of them still wearing the clothes they had on when the storm hit. The governor spoke. A minister led a prayer. The coffins were lowered into the ground, row after row, and the earth was shoveled over them. The sound of dirt hitting wood was a sound that everyone who heard it would remember for the rest of their lives. After the burial, the people of Beecher went back to work. There was no time to sit and mourn. There was too much to do. The winter was coming. The snow would start falling in a few months, and the people who were living in tents and temporary shelters needed real homes before then. The rebuilding began in earnest. It was not easy. The town had no money, no supplies, no resources of its own. Everything had to be brought in from the outside. But the outside was generous. Donations poured in from all over the country. Church groups sent money. School children sent pennies. Corporations sent building materials. The state government approved emergency loans. The federal government promised aid, though it would take months to arrive. The first buildings to go up were the schools. The children had to have somewhere to go. The old school had been destroyed, so a new one was built, a temporary structure made of wood and tar paper, but it was a school. The teachers showed up, even the ones who had lost their own homes, and they taught the children their lessons. They did not teach only math and reading. They taught about loss and grief and hope. They taught that life goes on even when it does not seem possible. The churches were rebuilt next. The church had been the heart of Beecher, the place where people gathered not just for worship but for community. The congregations met in tents and in basements and in the homes of survivors. They held services in the ruins. They sang hymns and prayed. Their voices carried across the empty lots and the piles of rubble, a testament to the resilience of faith. The homes went up slowly, one by one. The families who had insurance used their settlements to rebuild. The families who did not have insurance relied on charity and loans and the kindness of strangers. The houses were simple, functional, built to last. They were not fancy, but they were homes, and for the people of Beecher, that was enough. As the months passed, the physical scars of the tornado began to heal. The debris was cleared. The roads were repaved, the trees were planted again, but the emotional scars remained. The survivors carried them for the rest of their lives. They had nightmares, they flinched at thunder, they could not drive past a grain elevator without feeling their hearts race. They remembered the sound of the wind, the taste of the dust, the smell of the air in those 5 minutes that had changed everything. And yet they kept going. They rebuilt their lives, they had children, they started businesses, they planted gardens, they laughed again, they loved again, they lived again. That is the thing about survivors, they do not just survive. They find a way to live. But the Beecher tornado was not just a local disaster, it was a national wake-up call. The Weather Service at the time had no reliable way to detect tornadoes. Radar was in its infancy. Forecasters relied on reports from the ground, which were often too late. The tragedy in Beecher, along with other deadly tornadoes that same year, spurred a push for better warning systems. Within a few years, the first tornado warning systems were being developed. The lessons learned in Beecher saved countless lives in the decades to come. There is a monument in Beecher today, a simple stone marker dedicated to the victims of the 1953 tornado. Every year on the anniversary of the storm, the town gathers to remember. The names of the dead are read aloud. A moment of silence is held. And then the town goes on living as it has done every day since that terrible night. But the story of Beecher is not just a story of a disaster. It is a story of a community that refused to be defined by its worst moment. It is a story of people who looked into the face of death and did not look away. It is a story of strength and courage and the unbreakable bonds that tie a town together. And it is a story that still matters. In an age of climate change and extreme weather, the lessons of Beecher are more relevant than ever. We know now that tornadoes can strike anywhere at any time. We know that warning systems save lives. We know that preparation and resilience are essential. But we also know that the human spirit is resilient. We know that when the worst happens, ordinary people can rise to meet it. We know that community is not a place. It is a people, and the people of Beecher proved that over and over again, so let us remember them. Let us remember the 116 who died. Let us remember the hundreds who survived. Let us remember the volunteers who came from miles away. Let us remember the doctors who worked through the night. Let us remember the mothers who held their children close. Let us remember the fathers who dug through the rubble with their bare hands. Let us remember the children who lost their homes and found new ones. Let us remember Beecher. The sun was setting over the town on that first day after the storm, casting long shadows across the ruins. The survivors gathered in small groups staring at the horizon trying to understand what had happened. They had lost so much, but they were still there. They were still alive, and in that there was something that looked like hope. It was a fragile hope, a tentative hope, a hope that could be extinguished by a single gust of wind. But it was there. And as the stars came out one by one, the people of Beecher began to plan for the future. They did not know what that future would bring. They did not know how long it would take to rebuild. They did not know if they would ever feel safe again, but they knew one thing: they knew that they would not give up. They knew that they would not let the tornado have the last word, and they were right. The tornado had taken their homes and their loved ones and their sense of security, but it had not taken their spirit. That spirit, the indomitable spirit of Beecher, would carry them through the darkest days. It would carry them through the long winter of grief and the slow spring of recovery. It would carry them into a new morning, a morning that would dawn bright and clear and full of possibility. The story of the Beecher tornado is a story of loss, but it is also a story of hope. It is a story of a town that refused to die. And it is a story that reminds us that even in the face of the most terrible destruction, there is always a chance to begin again. The winds have passed, the silence has lifted. The voices of Beecher rise once more. They echo across the fields and the rebuilt streets and the quiet cemetery where the dead rest. They tell a story of courage and compassion and the stubborn refusal to give up. They tell a story that will never be forgotten. And that is the true legacy of the Beecher tornado. Not the damage, not the death, not the fear, but the love that held a community together when everything else had fallen apart. The love that rebuilt what had been destroyed. The love that lives on, even now, decades later, in the hearts of everyone who hears this story. So listen. Listen to the wind if you must, but listen also to the quiet voices of the survivors. They have something to tell you. They have something to teach you. They have something to give you. They give you hope. And that hope did not fade. In the weeks and months that followed, the people of Beecher found themselves the subject of a nation's attention. Reporters came from Detroit, from Chicago, from New York. They walked through the rubble with notebooks and cameras. They interviewed the survivors. They took pictures of the twisted metal and the shattered homes. The stories they told were heartbreaking, but they were also inspiring. The world wanted to know how this small town could face such devastation and still stand. One of the first reporters to arrive was a young woman named Evelyn who worked for the Detroit Free Press. She had covered fires and floods and factory accidents, but she had never seen anything like this. She stood at the edge of what had once been a neighborhood and tried to find the words to describe it. There were no words. She ended up writing about a little girl she met, a 7-year-old named Sarah, who had lost her mother and her father and her older brother. Sarah was staying with a neighbor, a woman who had taken in 3 other children as well. The neighbor had lost her own house, but she had found a tent somewhere and she had set it up in a field. The tent was crowded and cold and smelled of mud, but the children were fed and safe. Evelyn asked Sarah what she wanted people to know. Sarah looked at her with eyes that seemed too old for her face and said, "Tell them we are still here." That became the headline. "We are still here." It ran in newspapers across the country. Donations poured in faster than ever. A Jewish synagogue in New York sent a check for $5,000. A Catholic church in Chicago sent a truckload of food. A group of schoolchildren in California collected pennies in jars and mailed them in a big box. The Red Cross set up a relief center in a field, and volunteers worked around the clock sorting clothes and blankets and canned goods. There were so many supplies that they had to start stacking them in empty lots, covering them with tarps to keep them dry. The state government sent teams of engineers and architects. They assessed the damage and drew up plans for rebuilding. They recommended new building codes, stronger foundations, storm cellars. They advised that the new school be built on a slab of concrete with reinforced walls. The people of Beecher listened. They had learned the hard way what the wind could do. They would not make the same mistakes again. But the rebuilding was not just a physical task. It was an emotional one. The survivors had to learn to live with what had happened. They had to find a way to carry the grief and still move forward. Some of them could not. A few families left Beecher entirely, moving to other towns where the sky did not remind them of that night. Most stayed. They had roots here, deep roots. Their parents and grandparents were buried in the cemetery. Their children had been born in the hospital that no longer existed. They could not leave. They had to rebuild. The first winter after the tornado was brutal. The temporary shelters were drafty. The tar paper roofs leaked. The stoves were small and inefficient. The snow piled up and the cold seeped into the bones. The survivors huddled together, sharing blankets and body heat. They told stories to pass the time. They talked about the old days before the tornado when the town was whole. They talked about the people they had lost. They cried together, they laughed together. They became a family in a way that only tragedy can create. One of the most remarkable stories from that winter was about a woman named Clara. She had been a school teacher before the storm. She had lost her husband and her 2 daughters. She had been pulled from the rubble with a broken arm and a shattered leg. The doctors told her she would never walk again without a cane. Clara did not believe them. She spent hours every day doing exercises, pushing herself past the pain. By spring, she was walking with only a slight limp. She went back to teaching in the temporary school. She taught the children who had survived. She taught them to read and write and add and subtract. She also taught them to be brave. She told them, the wind took many things, but it did not take your future. That is yours to make. Clara's classroom was a model of resilience. The walls were bare, but she had hung drawings the children had made. They drew houses with big windows and flowers in the yard. They drew families holding hands. They drew sunshine and blue skies. They drew what they wanted the world to be, and in a way, they were drawing their own futures. The spring brought new life. The grass grew back over the scarred earth. The trees that had survived began to leaf. The birds returned. The people planted gardens, small ones at first in pots and boxes, then larger ones in the vacant lots where houses had once stood. They planted tomatoes and peppers and beans. They planted marigolds and zinnias. They planted hope. The first permanent building to go up was the fire station. It was a simple brick structure, but it had a siren, a new siren that could be heard all over town. The fire chief, a man named Frank, had lost his son in the tornado. He had been one of the first responders that night, digging through the debris until his hands bled. He had found his son's body in the wreckage of their home. He carried that image with him every day, but he also carried a determination. He trained his volunteers rigorously. He drilled them on storm procedures. He made sure that every family in Beecher knew where to go in a tornado warning. He did not want anyone else to die because they did not know. The new school was finished in the fall of 1955. It was a modern building with a basement that could serve as a storm shelter. The windows were made of safety glass. The walls were reinforced. The architects had designed it to withstand winds of up to 200 miles per hour. The children walked through the doors on the first day with a mix of excitement and fear. The hallways were clean and bright. The classrooms were filled with new desks and books. The principal gave a speech. He said, "This school is a symbol of our recovery. It is a place where we will learn and grow. It is a place where we will remember the past and build the future." But the scars were still there. Every time the sky darkened, the children would look at the horizon. Every time the wind picked up, the teachers would watch the children's faces. The nightmares did not go away easily. The flinch at thunder became a part of their lives. There were children who could not sleep through the night. There were children who refused to go outside when it was cloudy. The school hired a counselor, a kind woman named Margaret who had lost her own home. She talked to the children individually. She held group sessions. She let them draw pictures of the tornado, of the destruction of their fears. And then she helped them draw pictures of themselves surviving, of their new homes, of their new lives. The town held a memorial service on the first anniversary. It was a solemn event. The names of the 116 victims were read aloud. A bell was rung after each name. The crowd stood in silence. Some held candles, others held photographs. After the service, a group of survivors gathered at the cemetery. They placed flowers on the graves. They talked about the people who had died. They told old stories. It was not a day of grief alone. It was a day of remembrance and gratitude. They were grateful to be alive. They were grateful for each other. The second anniversary was different. It was more celebratory. The town had come a long way. The streets were paved. The houses were rebuilt. The businesses were open. There was a new grocery store, a new pharmacy, a new hardware store. The diner had reopened and the coffee was hot and strong. The town held a picnic in the park. There were games for the children, a pie-eating contest, a three-legged race. The band played, people danced, they laughed. It was not about forgetting, it was about living. Over the years, the story of Beecher faded from the national headlines. The world moved on to other disasters, other tragedies. But for the people of Beecher, the tornado was a defining moment. It shaped who they were and who they became. Parents told their children about that night. They described the sound of the wind, the smell of the dust, the sight of the funnel cloud. They taught their children to respect the weather, to take warnings seriously, to seek shelter without hesitation. They passed down the lessons of survival. The 1953 tornado was not the only one that year. There were deadly tornadoes in Texas, in Alabama, in Massachusetts. The tornado season of 1953 was one of the deadliest on record. More than 500 people lost their lives across the country. The cumulative toll shocked the nation. It forced the government to take action. The U.S. Weather Bureau, which had been reluctant to use the word tornado in forecasts for fear of causing panic, changed its policy. In 1954, it officially authorized the use of the word. It began issuing tornado warnings. It started a program to develop a national radar network. The first experimental weather radar, the WSR-57, was deployed in the late 1950s. It saved countless lives, but the change did not come fast enough for Beecher. The people who died that night might have survived if they had had a warning. They might have survived if the siren had been working. They might have survived if the weather service had been able to detect the storm in time. That knowledge weighed heavily on the survivors. Some of them became advocates for better warnings. They wrote letters to their congressmen. They testified at hearings. They spoke to reporters. They wanted to make sure that no other town would have to suffer the same fate. One of the most vocal advocates was a man named Robert who had lost his wife and 3 children. He had been at work when the tornado hit 30 miles away. He had driven home through the storm, not knowing what he would find. He found nothing. His house was a pile of rubble. His family was gone. He spent the next several years traveling the country, speaking at church groups and community meetings, telling the story of Beecher. He carried a photograph of his family, a faded picture from a happier time. He showed it to everyone he met. He said, "This is why we need warnings. This is why we need to be prepared. Do not let this happen to you." Robert's efforts, along with those of many others, helped push the federal government to invest in weather technology. The establishment of the National Severe Storms Forecast Center in 1954 was a direct result of the 1953 tornado season. Today, the National Weather Service has a network of Doppler radars that can detect tornadoes before they touch down. The average lead time for a tornado warning is now about 14 minutes. That is 14 minutes to get to safety. That is 14 minutes that the people of Beecher did not have. The town itself continued to evolve. Beecher was a small community and it remained small. It did not grow into a big city. It did not become a tourist attraction. It stayed humble and quiet. The new houses were built with basements. The new schools had storm shelters. The siren was tested every Saturday at noon, a reminder that the sky could turn at any time. The people knew that. They lived with that knowledge, but they did not live in fear. They lived in preparedness. The children of the survivors grew up and had their own children. The stories were passed down. The grandchildren of that fateful night heard about the tornado from their grandparents. They heard about the sound of the wind, the darkness, the chaos. They also heard about the courage, the kindness, the love. The story became a part of their identity. They were proud to be from Beecher. They were proud of what their grandparents had accomplished. They carried that pride into their own lives. In the 1970s, a historian from a nearby university came to Beecher to document the tornado and its aftermath. She interviewed dozens of survivors. She collected photographs and newspaper clippings. She recorded hours of testimony. She published a book called The Day the Wind Came, which became a local classic. The book was read in schools. It was discussed in church groups. It kept the memory alive for a new generation. The monument in the park was dedicated in 1983 on the 30th anniversary. It was a simple stone, polished smooth, with the names of the victims inscribed. A plaque read, "In memory of the 116 who lost their lives in the tornado of June 8, 1953. May their spirit of courage and community never be forgotten." Every year since then, the town has held a ceremony. The names are read, a moment of silence is observed. The mayor gives a speech. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there are smiles. Always there is a sense of connection, a sense that the past is not gone. And now, more than 70 years later, the Beecher tornado remains a part of the town's fabric. The survivors who were children in 1953 are now elderly. They tell their stories to great-grandchildren who listen with wide eyes. They describe the night the sky turned green. They describe the sound like a freight train. They describe the silence afterward. They describe the rescue. They describe the rebuilding. They describe the love. And the great-grandchildren learn that even in the darkest moments there is light. The lessons of Beecher are not just for that town. They are for all of us. They remind us that we are not alone. They remind us that community matters. They remind us that we can survive the unthinkable. They remind us that hope is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It is the thing that gets us through the night, that carries us into the next day, that gives us the strength to rebuild. So when you hear the wind pick up, when the sky turns dark, when the sirens sound, remember Beecher. Remember the 116. Remember the survivors. Remember the volunteers. Remember the mothers and fathers and children who faced the impossible and did not give up. And let their story remind you that you too can find the strength to face whatever comes. You too can find the hope to go on. You too can be part of something bigger than yourself. The sun rises over Beecher every morning. It rises over the fields and the homes and the schools. It rises over the monument in the park. It rises over the cemetery where the victims rest. It rises over the living who carry the legacy of that night in their hearts. And every morning the people of Beecher wake up and choose to live. They choose to remember. They choose to hope. That is the story of the Beecher Tornado. That is the story of a town that refused to be defined by its worst day. That is the story of a community that built a new future on the ruins of the old. That is the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. That is the story of love winning over fear. And as long as the wind blows and the skies turn dark, that story will continue. It will be told by parents to children, by teachers to students, by survivors to the world. It will never die, because hope does not die. It lives in the hearts of those who choose to carry it. And the people of Beecher carried it through the rubble, through the grief, through the long years of recovery. They carried it into the light of a new day. They carried it into the future, and they are still carrying it today. So listen. Listen to the wind if you must, but listen also to the quiet voices of the survivors. They have something to tell you. They have something to teach you. They have something to give you. They give you hope. And that hope, once received, must be passed on. It is not a gift to keep for yourself. It is a torch to carry forward, to light the way for others. The people of Beecher understood that. They did not hoard their resilience. They shared it. They opened their hearts and their homes and their town to anyone who needed it. They built a community that welcomed strangers and comforted the grieving. They became a beacon, a small but brilliant point of light in the darkness. Today, when you visit Beecher, you can still feel that light. The streets are quiet, the houses are neat, the lawns are trimmed. There is a sense of peace, a sense that this town has weathered its storm and found its calm. The children play in the park where the monument stands. They do not know the fear that once gripped this place. They only know the love that rebuilt it, and that is perhaps the greatest legacy of all. The Beecher Tornado was a tragedy. It was a loss that can never be fully measured, but it was also a triumph. It was a triumph of the human spirit, a triumph of community, a triumph of hope over despair. And as we face our own storms, our own challenges, our own moments of darkness, we can draw strength from Beecher. We can remember that even the worst winds eventually pass. We can remember that we are not alone. We can remember that love is stronger than fear. And we can remember that every ending is also a beginning. So let us carry that memory with us. Let us carry the names of the 116. Let us carry the stories of the survivors. Let us carry the courage of the volunteers. Let us carry the hope that rose from the rubble. And let us never forget that in the heart of Beecher, Michigan, on the night of June 8, 1953, a community proved that even the darkest storm cannot extinguish the light of the human spirit. That light still shines. It shines in the eyes of the children who play in the park. It shines in the laughter of the families who gather at the diner. It shines in the quiet moments of remembrance. It shines in the hearts of everyone who hears this story and decides to be brave, to be kind, to be strong. And so the story continues. It is not over. It will never be over. It is told and retold, passed from generation to generation, a reminder of what we can become when we face the impossible together. The winds have passed. The silence has lifted. The voices of Beecher rise once more. They echo across the fields and the rebuilt streets and the quiet cemetery where the dead rest. They tell a story of courage and compassion and the stubborn refusal to give up. They tell a story that will never be forgotten. And that is the true legacy of the Beecher Tornado. Not the damage, not the death, not the fear, but the love that held a community together when everything else had fallen apart. The love that rebuilt what had been destroyed. The love that lives on, even now, decades later, in the hearts of everyone who hears this story. So listen. Listen to the wind if you must, but listen also to the quiet voices of the survivors. They have something to tell you, they have something to teach you, they have something to give you, they give you hope, they give you hope. And hope, once received, must be passed on. It is not a gift to keep for yourself. It is a torch to carry forward, to light the way for others. The people of Beecher understood that. They did not hoard their resilience. They shared it. They opened their hearts and their homes and their town to anyone who needed it. They built a community that welcomed strangers and comforted the grieving. They became a beacon, a small but brilliant point of light in the darkness. But the story does not end with the monument or the ceremony. It continues in the lives of those who were shaped by that night. Take, for example, a man named Robert. He was 8 years old in 1953. He lost his mother and his younger sister. He was pulled from the rubble by a neighbor who did not even know his name. For years, Robert carried a photograph of his mother in his wallet. He never talked about the tornado. He never attended the memorials. He buried the memory deep inside, beneath the daily routines of school, work, marriage, and fatherhood. But the memory did not stay buried. It surfaced in nightmares. It surfaced in sudden, inexplicable tears. It surfaced when the wind picked up on summer afternoons. One year on the 50th anniversary, Robert's daughter convinced him to attend the ceremony. He stood at the back of the crowd, trembling. He listened as the names were read. When they reached his mother's name, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was another survivor, a woman who had been in the same shelter. She had not seen Robert since they were children. They embraced, they cried. And for the first time, Robert spoke about that night. He told his daughter what he had never told anyone. He described the sound. He described the darkness. He described the moment he realized his mother was gone, and when he finished, he felt a weight lift. He felt the hope that had eluded him for half a century. Robert began volunteering at the local historical society. He helped digitize the photographs and recordings collected by the professor from the nearby university. He visited schools and talked to students about the tornado. He told them not just about the destruction but about the rescue, about the volunteers who came from miles away, about the families who took in strangers, about the community that refused to break. He told them that hope is not a passive thing. It is a choice. It is an action. It is something you do every day even when it is hard, and the students listened. They asked questions. They wrote essays. Some of them began their own projects, interviewing their grandparents and great-grandparents, preserving the stories before they were lost. One student created a website with a map of Beecher, marking every home that had been destroyed and every family that had survived. Another student wrote a play performed by the high school drama club about the night of the tornado. The play was called The Quiet After. It ended with the cast linking hands and reciting the names of the victims. The audience sat in silence. Then they stood, they applauded, they wept. The play traveled to other towns. It was performed at a disaster preparedness conference. It was shown on public television. People who had never been to Michigan, who had never heard of Beecher, wrote letters to the drama club. They said the play helped them cope with their own losses. They said it gave them courage. They said it reminded them that they were not alone. That is the power of story. It reaches across time and distance. It connects the living to the dead. It connects the stranger to the survivor. It turns a single night of terror into a lasting lesson of love. The Beecher tornado also changed the way the nation thought about disaster response. In the years that followed, the federal government began to develop more organized systems for search and rescue, for shelter, for aid. The American Red Cross used Beecher as a case study for training volunteers. Meteorologists studied the storm to understand how tornadoes form and move. The Fujita scale, which measures tornado intensity, was not yet invented in 1953, but the Beecher tornado was eventually rated an F5, the highest category. That rating helped scientists learn what kind of damage a tornado could do and how to predict it. But the most profound lessons were not technical. They were human. They were about the way people respond when everything is stripped away. In Beecher, the response was not chaos. It was order. It was compassion. It was a spontaneous network of neighbors, farmers, and strangers who worked together without instruction or authority. They did not wait for orders. They acted. They carried the injured to makeshift hospitals. They dug through rubble with their bare hands. They fed the hungry and held the dying. That spirit of grassroots response became a model for community emergency planning. Today, disaster preparedness experts talk about the importance of community resilience. They talk about building social networks before the storm hits. They talk about the need for trust, for communication, for local leadership. They talk about Beecher. They use it as an example of what can happen when a community is prepared not just with supplies, but with relationships. And yet, for all the lessons, the most important thing about Beecher is not what it taught the experts. It is what it taught the people who lived there. They learned that they could survive. They learned that they could rebuild. They learned that they could love again. One of the most moving stories from the aftermath involves a young couple who lost everything. Their house was flattened. Their car was twisted into a metal ball. They had no money, no insurance, no family nearby, but they had each other. They slept on cots in the school gymnasium for weeks. They ate donated food. They wore donated clothes. They worked alongside the volunteers, clearing debris, sorting supplies, comforting others. And slowly, they began to rebuild. The man found work at a construction site. The woman took a job at the diner that had been rebuilt. They saved every penny. 2 years after the tornado, they bought a small house on a quiet street. It was not much, but it was theirs. They planted a garden. They painted the walls. They hung a photograph of their wedding day, which had been rescued from the rubble. The frame cracked, the glass shattered, but the image still clear. They had children. They told them about the night the wind came. They told them about the kindness of strangers. They told them about the hope that refused to die. And their children grew up knowing that no matter how bad things get, there is always a way forward. That family is still in Beecher. Their children have children now. They live in the same house, though it has been expanded and renovated. They still tend the garden. They still hang the wedding photograph, now framed in new glass. They still attend the annual ceremony. They still remember. And that is the gift of memory. It is not just about the past. It is about the future. It is about passing on the strength that was earned through suffering. It is about teaching the next generation that they too can face the impossible. So when the great-grandchildren listen with wide eyes, they are not just hearing a story. They are receiving a legacy. They are being given a tool. They are being shown a path. The path is not easy. It never has been. But it is there, worn smooth by the feet of those who walked it before, and all they have to do is take the first step. The Beecher Tornado has been the subject of books, documentaries, museum exhibits. The state historical marker stands beside the monument in the park. Every few years, a journalist or a historian comes to town to interview the remaining survivors. They ask the same questions. What do you remember? How did you cope? What do you want people to know? And the survivors answer with the same words. Remember the names, remember the helpers, remember that love is stronger than fear. One survivor, now in her 90s, was asked what she would say to someone who is going through a terrible loss. She paused, she looked out the window at the sunny street. She said, I would tell them that the pain never really goes away, but it changes, it becomes part of you, and you learn to carry it. And you learn to find joy again. It takes time, it takes help, but it comes. I promise it comes, she smiled. She pointed to a photograph on her wall. It was a black and white image of Beecher after the tornado. Rubble, dust, a broken tree. And in the corner, a single flower pushing through the wreckage. She said, that flower is hope, it always comes back. The sun continues to rise over Beecher. The children continue to play, the survivors continue to tell their stories, the legacy continues to grow. And the wind still blows, but it no longer brings fear, it brings memory, it brings a reminder of what was lost and what was found. It brings the voices of the 116 whispering through the leaves, telling us to hold on, to help each other, to never give up. And so we listen. We listen to the wind, we listen to the quiet voices, we listen to the hope. The story of the Beecher Tornado is a story of a single night, but it is also a story of every night that followed. It is a story of dawn breaking over the rubble. It is a story of hands reaching out in the dark. It is a story of a town that refused to be silenced. And that story will never end, because hope does not end. It lives in the hearts of those who carry it. And the people of Beecher carried it through the wreckage, through the grief, through the long years of healing. They carried it into the light of a new day. They carried it into the future, and they are still carrying it today. So when you hear the sirens, remember Beecher, remember the 116, remember the survivors, remember the volunteers, remember the mothers and fathers and children who faced the impossible and did not give up. And remember that you too can be part of something bigger than yourself. That is the hope they give you. That is the hope you must pass on.